Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Voices of Recovery. I'm your host, Michele Eich, and this is my book, How to Kill an Addiction, Recovery with God. In this book, I have how to walk through difficult situations by walking with Jesus. And I also have 20 incredible testimonies of real people who have overcome life-controlling issues with God's help. So I'd love it if you check it out. But every week I interview somebody who has overcome a life-controlling issue. And this week, my guest is Laura. Laura, welcome to Voices of Recovery.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. I've been looking forward to this interview for a while, but let's start out by having you introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Well, I'm 39 years old and I live in Oklahoma City. And I really, I've got a wide variety of interests. I really enjoy writing, and I do a lot of running as well. But one of my favorite things is I love to get together with other women and just talk about the Lord and talk about the Word, pray together. So I really enjoy just connecting with other women spiritually.
Amen. I love that. Well, Laura, you have a book called Transgender to Transformed. And I read your book, and it is incredible because you hold nothing back. I mean, you're very real. You talk about your journey, how things started. You actually transgendered into a man. You transitioned into a man and lived as a man for many years. And I want to get into your story, but first I'd like to say that you share in the book that you really had an issue with women. Like, you didn't really like women. You didn't like the fact that you were a woman. And for you to say that you enjoy being around women and doing Bible studies and just talking is just another incredible part of God's transformation in your life, right?
It is. Yeah. I'm really blown away at what God has done. And a lot of times people will tell me now that I'm one of the most feminine girls they know. And I've become, and the more that God has healed me, because for a while I think I buried myself in a lot of work and I was just kind of task oriented.
Yeah.
But the more that the Lord has healed me, I've become very relational, and I just love getting together with people and connecting both spiritually and emotionally.
That's beautiful. I love it. Well, again, I enjoyed your book, and I've been wanting to do an interview like this for some time, just because in our world today, the message that if you're a girl, you can be a boy. If you're a boy, you can be a girl. I mean, that is being pushed to younger children. And it's just very, very disturbing because we've kind of taken God out of the equation. When we take the creator out of the creation, or try to, we start to believe a lot of lies. So I really want to address those today because it's something that's a very hot topic today. It's very controversial. But when we go back to God's original design, we really can't argue with that. He is the creator and he determines what the creation is.
Right.
So good. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about your childhood, because you had a couple of events in your life, Laura, that you share in the book, and that you said this is kind of how the seeds were planted. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, when I was really little, my mom and I had kind of a difficult relationship, and I don't blame her at all now. It's taken me several years to kind of work through it all, because for a while I think I did have some anger, but now I'm beginning to really see and understand her story. And she will tell you in her own testimony, because sometimes we'll speak together, and she's said in her own testimony that she was kind of a legalistic Pharisee. She was doing all the right things, checking all the right boxes, but she didn't really have that relationship with the Lord. And she didn't understand that. And so I remember as a kid, I can still picture the stress on her face. She was just stressed out and burned out all the time and just didn't ever have time for me. And so it was like, go away, get off of me, leave me alone, go to your room. And that was just kind of the constant treatment. I remember my brother was very quiet and very obedient. And so he was like the golden child. And I remember so many times her talking about my brother, like he was so perfect and he never cried and he never caused any problems. And then it would be like, oh, Laura is such a handful. She's so annoying, all these things. And so I just really began to believe that my mom wished I had been a boy. And I found out that she miscarried 2 boys between my brother and I. And so I really began to believe that she had wished I'd been one of those boys.
Wow.
And so that planted seeds very early on that being a girl wasn't valuable, And it was, it was something so much less than. And I was constantly compared to my dad. I was told I looked just like him, I acted just like him. We were just two peas in a pod. And and I was pushed to do stuff with him all the time. My dad would sit down, and he was a great dad. And my mom she loved me. Now that I am older, I understand that she really loved me in a lot of ways. But I remember him sitting down and playing games with me almost every night after work. And I don't remember a single time mom sat down to play.
Okay.
And so it was just, there was a huge difference in the relationship with my parents.
Okay, interesting. So I've heard this quoted several times, and it says, rules and regulations without a relationship lead to rebellion. So
Yes.
if you see God as this taskmaster that I have to work for him and I have to try to please him all the time, that's not really who he is, but we can have that misconception about him and, like I said, become like a Pharisee. And we just don't have joy in our relationship. It's based on our performance, not his.
Mm,
And you share
yeah.
in your book, Laura, that you really had a very long season of rebellion. I mean,
Yes.
from a fairly early age. So maybe that view of God pushed you away a little bit. And again, you can see years later that it wasn't your mom's fault, but that might have added to it. It's like, well, if that's who God is, if you have to work and strive and try to check all these boxes and follow all these rules, then I really don't want anything to do with him, because we're making what should be a loving relationship into work, and it's religion.
Yeah. And I had no concept of a relationship with God. I think I may have heard those words,
Right.
but to me, it looked like nothing but doing all these things. And my mom had no joy, no peace,
Yeah.
no real faith. In fact, years later, she told me one time that I needed to trust the Lord. And I had never heard my mom say that. I had never, we would pray about things, but it was like just begging God to do what we wanted.
Yeah.
But I don't remember, there was no peace or joy or anything really in my mom growing up.
Wow.
And
Interesting.
so God seems so angry. And even now, I still struggle sometimes with that brokenness because it's so ingrained in me. So sometimes I'll still get on this performance track and I'm just waiting for God to beat me over the head and to punish me. And, sometimes God allows consequences, I know, but I still expect this harsh taskmaster sometimes. And I have to remind myself that God desires relationship with me, that he loves me. And it's not based on my performance.
Absolutely. I think it's something we all struggle with, really. But just when I hear you talking about that, it reminds me that we're on a journey with God. And so I often say, I haven't arrived, but I have left.
Yeah.
So even though I struggle with it sometimes, like I know at the end of the day, I know that he loves me no matter what.
Yeah.
So good. Well, unfortunately, you had a situation when you were 8 that was a traumatic situation. And I think you started to believe some lies about yourself as well. If you would share a little bit about that as you feel comfortable, but you did write about it in the book. And I think it shows kind of maybe how you made some decisions later on in life.
Yeah. When I was 8 years old, I was playing at a friend's house, and her brother pulled me into the bathroom and molested me, and there was a lot of mixed emotions because there was a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And at the same time, because, your body responds to it and it feels good. And so there was this curiosity that it opened at the same time. And so later I'd gone back to him and I said, hey, can we do that again? That really, that was kind of fun. And he totally rejected me and didn't want anything to do with me. And he's like, we can't ever do that again. That's how girls get pregnant. I didn't know anything about any of this stuff.
Right.
And I felt so much shame, and I just felt like I began to believe that men had all the power in the relationship, and I was just there for him to use and dispose of. I just remember early on just feeling like I didn't have any value as a girl, and I had no say in the relationship. And so when I was in high school, I think it really affected my relationship with men because I was always desperate for them not to leave me, and I would get clingy and just very, very, I would do absolutely anything to keep a man.
Wow.
And so I started giving myself away sexually to do anything everything they wanted. And I was dumped and rejected over and over and over again.
Wow. So in the book, Lord, you write that you started to believe that if men have the power and I don't want to be rejected anymore, maybe if I were a male, then I would have that power and I would not be rejected.
Yeah.
That kind of how
Yeah.
the thought process went.
Yeah, it started when I was I was in my later stages in college, and well, I was about 25. I went to school a little bit later and kind of stretched it out because I actually really loved school.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I remember this thought process. I had finally gotten a man that wanted a relationship with me after years of rejection, but it was a horrible relationship. He was
Mhm.
a severe alcoholic, and it was just so bad. And so sometimes it was worse being in that than being without a relationship.
Sure.
And I think I was always really, really insecure without a relationship.
Mm.
And so I began to think, you know, if I was the man, I know how I want to treat a woman. And so even though I had this deep sense of hatred against women, and yet there was this curiosity because I thought, you know, if I can reverse these roles and I don't have to be the woman, I can be the man. But I was physically attracted to men, but there was this curiosity and this desire.
Sure.
But it really became more about me wanting to be a man. I used to tell people I didn't really care who I dated because I wanted to be a man.
Hmm.
And really, when I began to embrace that, I was so convinced that it's who I was that I absolutely began to believe I had been born in the wrong body, and it's always who I was. And it was like
Wow.
once I embraced that, it's all the memories and everything started coming back, and it was like, oh, this all makes sense. And I
Okay.
think that's what happens a lot of times, and you start interpreting your entire childhood through that lie that you're believing.
Right.
And every little thing will sort of reinforce that.
Hmm.
Like I remember liking my brother's hand-me-down clothes rather than my sister's. I remember that, you know, mom used to tell me that I looked better with short hair than long hair. You know, I had trouble with my female system not working properly. So see, I should have been a boy.
Right.
Things like that.
Mm. That's really interesting. In the book, you mentioned that when you were 14, you went to, I think it was just a slumber party, and they had a Ouija board.
Mhm.
And, this is something that I think is pretty common. And you felt like that there was actual demonic activity as a result of that. And I think people look at things like that and think, well, that's just a game. It's just a silly little thing. We're just kids, but not realizing that that can open a door to demonic activity coming in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't know it was real. I thought it was a game. And
Right.
you know, I remember being surprised, but like you could feel it moving. And I'm like, wait, my hand's not doing that. And
Right.
then we were doing these spells that we'd seen on a movie or something. And it was like things were actually working. And it really, it opened a curiosity in
Mm.
me. And I didn't get real involved in demonic stuff after that. But I know that the demonic spirits came into my life and began to really influence me. And I started to desire to be a little bit rebellious. And I started really rebelling against my parents a little bit, pushing back against their authority. And I started getting into even more depths of sexual sin because I had experimented throughout between the time I was molested and between that time, which was started when I was probably 15, close to 16, really getting sexual. Between that time, I had experimented some with some friends, you know, some mutual sex play, but really started getting sexual around that time.
Interesting.
And it really began to change me. And I began to get very, very dark. And I remember a time in high school where I told the Lord I would never serve him again. And I really I think a lot of it was not only just the sexual curiosity, but the Lord showed me a verse in Hebrews recently that really began to explain some of what I went through. And it says, looking diligently, lest any man fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. And so all the bitterness and anger, because for years I had been building up this anger toward my mom.
Mhm.
And I think part of what happened was not just uh, how the relationship was, but I remember feeling like I wasn't being seen, and she didn't realize that I was upset, and I didn't know how to talk about it and express it. And so I would try to drum up more emotion and get angry and angry and angrier at her. So it's like if I can be angry enough, then she'll realize that I'm upset and I'm needing to talk. And so I would, by this point in my life, I was so angry and so deeply, deeply bitter at her. I absolutely hated her. And so it was my own bitterness and unforgiveness that began to lead me down this path of defilement. And the Lord was showing me why this happens, because when people wall off their heart emotionally and they begin to blame God for a lot of these things, and then they'll wall off their heart spiritually. And then all of a sudden, all you have left is the flesh. And all, and you'll do everything you can to satisfy the flesh. And you become a slave to those fleshly addictions.
Mhm.
And so I really went down this path of extreme sexual promiscuity, and I was sleeping around with anybody and everybody, doing anything they wanted. And I told God I would never serve him again. And I changed my friend groups. I really abandoned my Christian friends, sought out new friends that were drinking and partying. I remember at one point I was listening to a lot of horrible music, and I was listening to Alice Cooper, and there was a song about poison running through your veins. And I was like, yes, I want that darkness and that evil. So I was just asking these demonic spirits to come into me, and I want evil running through my veins because I was so angry and so deeply bitter.
Wow. Well, I think that's why God warns us not to let a root of bitterness grow in our heart, because when
Mhm.
that does, it produces fruit that is very destructive.
Right.
So, speaking of the demonic activity, Laura, you mentioned that there was an ancient pagan god who was transgender, and you became obsessed with this god.
Yeah, I didn't realize what it was at the time. Or people will argue whether, some will call it transgender or like both male and female,
Hmm?
because they had breasts and the male genitalia, but a
Okay.
lot of transgenders don't have the lower surgery. And that's actually a lot of the transgenders I knew, that was kind of where they were at. But regardless, this was actually a fairly famous, quote, God with a little g, like,
Right.
or demon, as I would call it. But
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
got this character out of a book that was Marilyn Manson's biography that my boyfriend at the time had given me. And I was just drawing this character in my notebook, and I had it. I don't even remember a lot of it. There's a lot of things I did during those years that I don't remember. But my uncle told my mom that he had seen this drawing like stuffed underneath my mattress and stuff like that. And then I came out of the shower one day. I'd gone to live with my uncle for a few months in Alaska.
Right.
And I came out of the shower one day, and he had gone in after me, and he said this same character was drawn in the steam of the mirror. And
Mm.
it really began to manifest a lot in my life. And he had seen some very dark spirits in the house. There was one day I was walking down the stairs, and I was just in this horrible rage. And the cat dropped dead right beside me. And we believe that the demon killed the cat.
Mm.
So, I mean, there was just all kinds of crazy things going on. But, he prayed with me to try and get rid of this demon. And
Mhm.
I allowed him to kind of pacify him. But inside I was asking this demon not to leave me.
Yeah.
And after a few minutes, God told him that I didn't want the demon to leave. And I
Wow.
was stunned because I didn't think God actually talked to people.
Right.
I'd
Yeah.
never
I
heard about
found
that.
that I found that portion of the book quite interesting. And there are people who don't believe in demonic activity. There are people that say, oh, that would never happen in our country, that would be somewhere else. But Jesus says to cast out demons.
Mhm.
Now, we as believers have that authority, but if you want to keep the demon, it's not going to work, which is what God
Yeah,
told your uncle.
right.
And that dabbling in that kind of stuff is very, very scary. But it leads to things getting progressively worse, just like any sin,
Yeah.
right? And we dabble in things. It's fun. The partying's fun. Maybe
Mhm.
hooking up with different people is fun. All of it is fun for a season. And the Bible even says
Yeah.
that. But then as that progresses, we think we're free, like, hey, I'm free. God's not going to tell me what to do. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm free to do what I want. But really the lie is that you're free. The truth is you're in bondage.
Absolutely.
You're in bondage to the enemy, you're in
Mhm.
bondage to the demonic activity, and you're in bondage to sin, which you shared
Yeah.
in the book that, you know, you were having different partners and things like that, but it wasn't satisfying you.
Right.
It was just
Yeah, and
leading to
not only
frustration.
is it not satisfying, but I think I was dealing with so much shame and guilt, and I would go, I joined an adult hookup site, and I would go meet these random men, and there would be so much excitement and anticipation on the way, and I was always hoping that one of them would actually want me. I knew instinctively, I think that they didn't most of the time, and I would say, oh, there's no strings attached, you know.
Mhm.
I was so desperate to be
Mm.
wanted, I think. And but when I would leave, I would feel so dirty and shameful and so guilty. And it was just a horrible feeling.
Mm.
And but I would repeat this cycle over
Right.
and over and over. And I'm actually really grateful because I had some pretty serious weight problems at the time. I think it's far less than it would have been because I was meeting any man that was willing to.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. And I really appreciate your transparency, both in the interview and the book, because I think that seeing the progression of things helps people. Because,
Yeah.
you know, if, and my hope is that someone who's struggling with this will read the book and realize it's maybe not the picture that is painted, right? The enemy paints
Right.
this wonderful picture and it's just so fantastic, but the reality is quite different.
Yeah. And just to, for anybody out there there are so many young women getting into sexual sin. I never expected when I was 16 years old to be on adult hookup sites or to be deep in a porn addiction.
Mhm.
You know, it's not like anybody intends to go there and you think, oh, I can just do
Yeah.
this one little thing. I can just go have sex with my boyfriend. But the reality is it was never enough.
Yeah.
And when you start getting some self-worth and value from that sexual encounter, you start chasing that. You know,
Mhm.
Jesus said, he who commits sin is the slave of sin for a reason. It's
Right.
true.
Right.
I absolutely became a slave to that. I became a slave to porn. I became a slave even to like cigarettes, and so many other things. And
Mm.
I was just addicted to all kinds of things, anything to satisfy the flesh. But the problem is, like you said earlier, it's only satisfying for a season, and then it isn't.
Yeah, and that's my story. Mine's different than yours, but the same principle, right? Trying to fill that void, doing things to fill the void, getting excited about it, then feeling the shame, swearing you're never going to do it again, and then
Mhm.
going back to that vomit again and
Yes.
again until Jesus sets you free from that. So at
Mhm.
what point, Laura, did you decide, okay, you've had these thoughts of I should have been a boy, um, you know, and with what happened to the miscarriage of your brother and things like that, and the molestation that you endured at the age of 8, at what point did you say, okay, like this is the answer, this makes sense to me, I'm really a boy, I'm going to, or a male, I'm going to take the steps to transition to make that happen? At what point, how old were you at that time in your life?
I was 25, and one thing I forgot to mention about childhood that I think was really key that I'd kind of forgotten about.
Mhm.
I wrote stories about being a boy, and
Mm.
I was a writer, so I mean, I would write down in my notebook, but sometimes even in my head, night after night after night, and I would tell these stories about me being a boy all the time, and I think it fed into this identity. So I was remembering when I was 25, and I was beginning to have. I just realized that no man really wanted me,
Mm.
and I was so jealous of men. I'd been jealous of my brother my whole life.
Yeah.
And I remember I went on this romantic weekend. Well, it was supposed to be a romantic weekend with my boyfriend at the time, the alcoholic that was a horrible relationship. And I was just walking on eggshells the whole weekend. It was horrible. And I remember thinking, the reason that this never works, the reason I'm never happy is because I was supposed to be the man. And it
Mm.
was like everything began to make sense of my childhood. It was like I had always identified more with boys. I'd never gotten along well with girls at school. In fact, one of my best friends when I was little, my mom grounded us from each other at one point because we couldn't get along. And I was always playing with the boys at recess. And so it was like everything just began to make sense. And everything got put through that filter. And I went to the support group meeting that I found, and within 5 minutes, they're like, "Oh, you are definitely transgender." It's like, I knew it. This is me.
Yeah.
All this makes sense. And I was worried about that. I was worried that I would never look like a girl. And they said, "Oh, don't worry about it. After a year or so of taking hormones, no one will ever know you were a girl." And that's what I'd wanted to hear all my life. That was really kind of the hook that the enemy set in me. And after that, like once I heard that and decided that's who I was, I didn't even want to be openly transgender. I wanted to be a man and absolutely erase the existence of Laura. I didn't want anyone to know I'd been a girl. And so I really went down that path. I mean, with everything within me, everything in life became about that. And I think a lot of people don't understand the narcissism and the egocentric worldview that comes into a trans person's life, because you have to constantly try to reaffirm it, because you're living a lie, and you have to somehow override it constantly. I was reminded all the time that all this was fake, and you think it's going to be real one day, but I mean, like every time you go to the bathroom, you're reminded of the reality of your body.
Yeah.
And so it was a constant reminder, and constantly trying to reaffirm it. And so, I mean, I had been a slave to porn and sex and other things, but now I became an absolute slave and an absolute bondage to this identity. Wow. And I was constantly trying to override the truth that I knew with the lies. And so everything became all about affirming that identity. And I would just live for these little affirmations. Anything somebody would say to me, whether it was being called sir at the drive-through window, or I remember one time I was working at a jewelry counter at JCPenney, and this customer said that I had big hands, which was weird because I actually have very little hands. For whatever reason, they looked bigger that day, but it just like all those little things seemed to reinforce this lie.
Wow. Interesting. Well, you share in the book, Laura, that kind of like the process. So you went to counseling, then, the counselor recognized that you had issues with your mom, but it was just like, your goal there was just for them to tell you, yep, you have, is it transphoria, or what is the terminal?
Originally, it was called gender identity disorder. It was considered a mental disorder. They eventually did change it to gender dysphoria.
Gender dysphoria.
And they said on the DSM's website, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use. And on their own website, they had stated, at least at one point, that it was pressure from the transgender activists that caused them to change it. Now they say it is a good thing, like, oh, we understand the issue better now.
Right.
But yeah, so it wasn't based on any kind of science that they changed it from a mental disorder to just sort of this feeling, or this, I mean, dysphoria is just basically dissatisfaction. It's the opposite of euphoria.
Sure.
So saying gender dysphoria, well, we probably all have gender dysphoria in the sense that there's times we don't like being who we are for whatever reason.
Right.
So it's hard to be a woman in some ways. It's hard to be a man in some ways for the men, but so it's basically anybody could have these feelings of not liking their gender for whatever reason.
Right.
So the whole thing's ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And again, as our society moves further away from God and his word, like God and his word are the plumb line of truth. And as we move further away from that, we can believe a lot of lies. And, one of the mantras of today is to trust the science, but their science says there are 54 genders, and it's like, God's word is clear. I created male and female. I created you to be a female. That's it. Right. End of discussion. But, if you don't believe in God, the Bible says, this is not me saying it. The Bible says, a fool says in his heart, there is no God.
Right.
So even if you are a doctor or a psychiatrist, or you have all these letters after your name, or whatever the case may be, if you are neglecting God and his word and not coming into agreement with what he says about the creation, you're a fool.
Right.
I don't care what your IQ is. I don't care what, how big your mansion is. I mean, that's just the way it is. But this is where we are. And a lot of it could have to do with the demonic influence of this transgender God. I mean, we hear stories of it being in the entertainment industry and everything. I'm not really going to go there because that's speculation, but I think that there is an agenda here to take what God made to be good and to twist it.
Yeah.
To get people to believe lies. And this is
it's
not what people want to hear, but this is what you've walked out, Laura. So, I mean, you've lived it.
Yeah. And, I think you're right that there is an agenda to destroy the image of God, and Satan hates the image of God. He hates what God has created. Yeah. And male and female are supposed to represent Christ and his bride. And so there's more than it's not arbitrary. I've been really meditating and studying on why God created. I mean, we won't know until we get to heaven why God created male and female, but I've learned a lot. And one, it's the very first thing that is known and recognized about a child. It's generally the first thing declared over a child, that they are male or female. In the Bible, it's actually the first thing God says about humans. Well, he says that they're made in the image of God, and he says they are male and female. And scientists have discovered over 6,500 biological differences between men and women. And that's just what we know. We know that we can't fully know everything that God knows this side of heaven. And I mean, for eternity, he's infinite. So we're never going to understand it all, but even in what I've studied, every single part of the body, from the eyes to the nose to every muscle, every bone, every part of our body is designed to fulfill the roles that God gave us. Women's entire bodies are created to nurture and foster life, not only through birth, but also rearing children. And, for women that don't have children, they can be that way with other children, either through the church or sometimes just fostering life in other relationships. But we are really made to be relational. Our entire body speaks to that. And there's many examples of that. One, our elbows are actually at a different angle, as well as our hips are wider, to make kind of a seat for the baby and to be able to hold the baby in a way that a man can't. He can hold the baby differently, but he's also stronger, so his muscles are able to do that. But a woman's hearing is also different. So women are not. Yeah, seriously. This is hilarious. When I started studying this, women are not able to tune out repetitive noise. And this was like a light bulb. I was like, I had been saying for years, I can't stand alarms and timers. Any constant noise just drives me absolutely out of my mind. I have to stop it. A baby crying in the store, if I can't comfort it or something, because it's not my kid, but I'm like, it just drives me insane and I have to get away from it. But of course, God designed women to not be able to tune out our baby's cry. And then men, though, are able to perceive subtle differences in an audio environment. And they're also really adept at determining where a sound is coming from. So you can imagine this speaks to his protection of the family. If he's better at hearing a predator, or determining where a sound is coming from, if there's any kind of danger. And so I think, but the entire body is designed that way as you really start studying it. So I was fascinated by this. So I think male and female is so much more profound than we even understand.
Laura, that's so good. And when you really dive into how God created us, and his word is clear, and in the early chapters of Genesis of how he created male and female and the differences. And we focus on the genitalia or the hormones, but every cell in our body is screaming, right? XX, you're a female, XY, you're a male. It's just that simple. But I just love to hear that. And that it just could open a door for a beautiful study of just how he made us to be different. And it's like, we want in our society, well, that's sexist, and, women can do this and men can do this. And it's not the way he intended it to be. It just isn't. And again, when we get away from him and his word, we skew things, and we're also believing lies of the enemy. And what you said about male and female represent Jesus and his bride. I mean, wow, that I could just meditate on for hours, if not days, because that's so beautiful. And of course, the enemy is going to want to come after that, right?
Right.
Because he hates that.
Right.
That's powerful. Well, I want to study that more, and I'm so glad you mentioned it, because it's the beauty of God's creation is what we're talking about. But I want to move on. So you had the counseling, and then you kind of go through the stages of transitioning up into the point where you actually had your breast removed surgically. When you wrote
Yeah.
about that, that was like, wow, that was kind of disturbing, to be honest with you, because I'm just thinking of my own anatomy and just how, like, you describe how you're lying on the bed there and seeing the marks on your breasts of where they're going to be cutting and removing them. And it sounds like you kind of had a moment of clarity where you realized, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. But as you progress with the hormones and the surgeries and everything, it's like you talked about earlier with the narcissism, everything is to try to come against the truth, right? You're
Right.
continuing to, it's like a little bit of truth comes in, like you are a female, God created you to be a female, but then
Yeah.
you have to counteract that. And instead of submitting to that truth, you double down in the lie. And that's where a lot of people live, and not just with their sexuality, but a lot of different things. It's like a little bit of light truth comes in, and then it's like, nope, nope, I'm gonna push forward with it.
Yeah, and that happens a lot, actually. There was back in the 50s, there were these psychologists that went and lived among a cult, and one of the psychologists actually coined the term that I hear a lot now, called cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
And he talked about this phenomenon, how when people have invested in what they later realize is a lie, if they've been, some of these people had sold their homes and uprooted their entire lives to go live in this cult. And of course, they didn't know it was a cult, but for whatever they believed. And then when they were faced with contradictory evidence, they would override the truth with some other information, and they would often proselyte and try to get other people to believe it with them, even though they realized that they were believing a lie.
Wow.
And it's amazing how trans people will do the same thing because we're too invested, and especially once you start manipulating your body.
Yeah.
And so I had already, I had changed. One, it was just too painful to be a female. There was no way I wanted to go back to being female. So even though I was beginning to realize that some of this was very fake, it was still better than being a girl, because there was so much pain there, and I didn't realize how painful it was. So I had already been binding my breasts for a long time. So I had done a lot of damage to my breasts as it was. I had a much lower voice at the time. I was growing facial hair. And so it was like, this is a one-way train. There's no way to go back.
Right.
Nor did I want to go back. And so and it started with this letter from my aunt. Well, she'd written me an email, and she said, Laura, you are such a beautiful girl. You are being deceived by the devil. This is straight out of the pit of hell, and you don't have to do this. Please don't do this.
Wow.
And my aunt was the one woman in my life growing up that I knew absolutely loved me. This woman was so good to me. And I was devastated by her letter, in a sense, because I was really angry, but I knew she was right, and I knew she loved me. And I just didn't want to face the fact that she was right. Yeah. But as I was laying there on the operating table, and I looked down, and these little dotted cut lines all over me, it was like something out of a horror movie. Honestly, it was so terrifying. And I thought, what if I don't wake up? What if she's right? What if I wake up in hell? Yeah. And I was really, really scared. And I was so determined to do this. I really began to almost cry. And I said, God, I know this wasn't your will. And I was surprised I admitted that thinking back.
Right.
But I hadn't prayed in years. And so God used this to draw me back to him just a little bit. I didn't get saved at that moment. This is years before I got saved. But it was just that acknowledgement that I knew I was in sin, and I knew this wasn't God's will. But I just didn't see any other way. I didn't understand. I still saw God as creating all these rules. I didn't understand that God really did know what was best for me. And so it was like, I thought I knew better. And so it was like, I have to do this. This is who I am. And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm not following what you want me to do, but I just asked God to spare my life. I said, please have mercy on me and spare my life.
Yeah. Wow. That's some heavy stuff. I watched an interview with you, Laura, and you were sharing that, and this is something that is not in the public, this is something that I think the enemy wants to hide because he doesn't want this truth to come out, that a lot of people who have surgeries on their genitalia, whether male transitioning to female or female to male, they lose their sensation, they lose their ability to actually have sex. I mean,
Right.
and what was the percentage of that? I can't remember, of people who completely lose their ability to function sexually after this.
I don't know if they've improved any at all since then. At the time when I looked it up, it was anywhere from 40 to 60% would lose all sexual feeling.
Wow.
And that was permanent. It was nerve damage. And so I knew that was a possibility, and it was devastating. And I had all the female organs removed. I never ended up having the genital reassignment, but really it was, even knowing all of that, and I knew that, like, when I started looking up the surgery options, I was so angry that no one had ever told me, because first of all, it was so artificial. I knew it was not ever going to be real. I knew that I would likely lose at least some, if not all, sexual feeling. And there, on top of that, there were so many complications. And I've just heard horror stories. I know of one girl that's had 31 corrective surgeries. I know a girl that's permanently in a wheelchair, and all kinds of urinary problems. I mean, just the list could go on and on. And it was horrible when I started really looking into this, but I was so convinced this is who I was, and I wanted it so desperately. And I was such a slave to this identity. And I kept thinking, maybe if I have this, then everything will be better. I knew it was never quite going to be real, but it was like I would at least be a little closer. But I was such a narcissistic, selfish person that I wish my parents were dead so I could have their inheritance money. That's the only way I was ever going to be able to afford it. It would have cost me about $100,000.
Wow.
And I knew that I was not ever going to be able to have that money in my lifetime. And I'm so thankful now, because I missed out on insurance covering it 3 times. I had a job where it was covered after I left, and I had another job where they had covered it before I got the job, but then they changed insurance.
Okay.
And then finally, the 3rd time was right before I left the lifestyle, and Obamacare started covering it. And I knew I was under so much conviction, even though I was still living in that lifestyle. I was under so much conviction. I knew I could not go through with it. And I was devastated, because it was like, finally, I have the ability to do this. Because I could have gotten the government to pay for it. And I finally had that option, and I knew I couldn't. And I had to really let it go. And it was extremely painful.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. And as you were talking, Laura, a lot of people, whether they're struggling with sexuality or not, we kind of have this belief that, well, when I do the next thing, like when I have the surgery, I'll be a male, or when I have my reproductive organs taken out, I'm a male. And, and you share in the book that you would do those things and you realize I'm still not male, because again, every cell in your body is saying you're a female. And you even mentioned Caitlyn Jenner. Like, Caitlyn Jenner is still biologically a male, and he is Bruce Jenner, but it's again part of our society, part of our culture, part of the work of the enemy that's moving us toward this type of thing, being confused about our sexuality, and again, moving away from the way God created us to be. Well, I want to make sure that we leave time at the end for you to share what you're doing now, and also I want you to talk to people who are kind of struggling with these issues. So let's kind of fast forward a little bit to where you kind of, God is starting to draw you, and your eyes are being open to the truth and the reality that you called yourself Jake, and you legally changed your name to Jake, but you were just really Laura. So if you could share kind of, and again, you portray it beautifully in the book. We just don't have time to share all of it. And I definitely encourage people who are watching to get your book, and I will let them know how to do that. But kind of walk through the process of you reawakening to the fact that you are a female, and how God kind of got your attention with that.
Yeah, God had been drawing me back for years through many different things. And I just encourage anyone that's praying for someone that lives in this lifestyle or any kind of rebellion against God. God was answering their prayers the whole time. You
Mm.
know, I think sometimes we think that God will answer our prayer one day because we don't see the fruit of it. But God plants seeds, and seeds take time
Yes.
to grow. In
Yes.
fact, Jesus
Mm.
said that if a seed springs and grows up immediately, it withers because it has no root. So sometimes God's work is very slow in
Totally.
our eyes. But he was drawing me for years through things I heard
Mm.
on the radio, in my dreams. And I just didn't want God. I didn't want to turn away from my sin. I was so angry at God. I felt because I still had a wrong perception of God. But when he really began to draw me was when I was working on a website for my mom's Bible study, and he was beginning to reveal himself to me. I
Mm.
had always felt so condemned and so convicted, or not convicted, but so condemned about sin. And I just felt like God, I was never going to measure up to what God wanted. But all of a sudden, God began to reveal himself to me and
Mm.
his faithfulness, his trustworthiness, his goodness.
Yeah.
You know, Romans says that it's the goodness of God that leads to
Amen.
repentance.
Yes.
And so when he began to show me who he was,
Mm.
that's what began to turn my heart a little bit. And through that, he showed me that my mom had been completely transformed through those years. And she had a
Mm.
real relationship with him now. She was filled with faith and peace, the things that I had never seen in her growing up. And it was like when he really opened my eyes to that, it was like I knew the gospel was true. It was
Amen.
like all of a sudden Christ was alive because I could see the way that he had transformed her. And I gave my heart to the Lord. And in the book, I detail this encounter that I had with the Lord that was just this
Mhm.
radical transformation. And I got so transformed, and I was on fire for the Lord.
Mm.
And I wanted to be a man of God, and I was zealous, and I was sharing with all my friends. And I wanted to live for the Lord with all my heart, but I didn't know that God was not going to lead me there.
Mm.
And he began to pursue me, and he began to convict me, and he gave me such a hunger for his word that I was listening to some form of Bible teaching, either audio Bible or Bible study, all day long every day. I was so hungry for his word, and he just began to chase me down just very
Mhm.
gently. You know, he never he didn't condemn me, but he began to really pursue me.
Mm.
And there were so many ways that he spoke to me, so many encounters I had. And I finally, there was one night where I literally fell out of bed. I was under so much conviction, and I just began to cry to him with all my heart. I was like, God, I don't know how to fix this. I can't be a woman. There was so much pain there every time I thought about it, and I didn't even know why. But it
Mm.
was just the last thing on earth I wanted. I was like, I am willing to do anything else. And when I realized that that's what God wanted, I began to beg God with all my heart to take my life because I didn't see any way out. I was like, I can't fix this. I've had all these surgeries. I've had hormones. I have facial hair. I have a job where I'm only known as male. I have this partner. My voice was a lot lower, and they're saying this is all permanent and irreversible. I was
Mm.
like, there's no way I can go back. And I finally saw myself in this deep, dark pit I couldn't get out of. And I could see the light at the top, but there was no way out. And he reminded me of Matthew 16, verses 24 through 26. It says, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever will save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his own soul?
Mm.
Or what shall he give in exchange for his soul?
Mm.
And I remember I had this clear vision of Jesus Christ getting down on one knee. He reached his hand down into this pit, and he said, do you trust me? And I knew he was asking me to walk away from everything. And he didn't tell me what the rest of my life was going to look like. I thought I was going to look like a freak the rest of my life. I thought I was going to be absolutely miserable. But I
Mm.
knew that he had promised me that one day that I was going to have a glorified body. I knew that I would no longer have a sin nature. I knew that everything was going to be okay one day. Like if I can just hang on. And so I
Mm.
really thought I was going to be absolutely miserable. But as I walked away from it all and I was obedient, I have no idea how I had the strength or the faith to do it. I look back and the Lord just carried me. I had this little bit of faith and this little yes, we call it little yeses in our ministry, just this little step of obedience,
Right.
one thing at a time
Mm.
as he would draw me and ask me to do little things. And it wasn't about performance. It was really about trusting him.
Yes.
And it was this longing. I wanted him more than I wanted my next breath.
Mm.
And so as I really began to die to myself and to let those things go, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And it just began to crush me. But at the same time, They talk about olives are a type of the olive oil is a type of the Holy Spirit, and olives to release that oil, they're crushed, and that's why I begin to feel crushed under all of this, and yet, there was so much work that the Lord was doing. And as he began to peel away the layers of the onion, as I began to forgive my mom, as I began to let go of all the bitterness, as I began to let go of the lies that I had believed, he began to absolutely transform me. And I remember looking back one day and going, well, I knew that I wasn't transgender. He began to break away those lies. But I remember looking around the room one day, I was in this discipleship group with these girls. And I had, in the first 6 months or so, I saw myself as like, well, I wasn't a man and I wasn't a transgender anymore, but I really didn't see myself as being equal with the girls. It was like, okay, they're letting me be part of this, but I'm still this kind of weird person. But all of a sudden I looked around the room and I was like, I'm just one of the girls.
Right.
And it was amazing to me. And God really began to heal me and show me that I had been a woman all along. And the lies of me, I don't even like the label tomboy, because as a kid, it made me feel like I was different than the girls, and I know there are girls that are more athletic that maybe act a little more like a boy. A lot of times that's because they're around boys a lot more. I played with my brother a lot, and just because I was athletic didn't mean I was a boy or that I was more like the boys.
Yes.
It meant I was more athletic, but as God began to peel away those layers and those labels that had put on me, I just began to realize that I had been a girl all along. And I'm so thankful to the Lord now, even though it was the most painful thing I've ever been through in my life. I'm so incredibly thankful and grateful for what he's done. And now you couldn't pay me enough to go back. I'm so set free and just so thankful for what he's done.
Amen.
But I also want to say to anyone that is maybe going through this, and God allows different struggles in different ways. And some people will still struggle with these feelings maybe till the day they die, but it gets less and less over time as we submit to the Lord, as we continue to follow him. He promises healing, so I don't know what that's going to look like for every person. But at the same time, I can tell you that no matter what I've struggled with, because I still struggle in a lot of other areas, I still have a lot of insecurities. I still have a lot of other brokenness that I'm working through, but it's all been worth it. God promises us over and over and over that he will bless our obedience, our trust and faith in him. In Hebrews 11, it says, without faith, it's impossible to please him. You can't have faith without obedience.
Absolutely. Wow, those are some powerful words, Laura. Thank you for sharing that and for sharing your heart and your journey. It takes courage to do that, and especially in a climate where this is becoming more and more acceptable, and especially with young children, middle school children, it's causing a lot of heartache, and it's being normalized when it's not normal. I taught middle school for many years, and I know how impressionable middle schoolers can be, how they can, hear something and, oh yeah, I'm that too, and then make these decisions that are going to affect them the rest of their lives. But when you wrote about when Jesus got down on one knee and asked you if you trusted him, that brought tears, because just thinking about your journey and how you were looking for that affirmation in men and different relationships. And I had that as well in my own life because of rejection that I had faced. It's really Jesus' love, his unconditional love, that gives us that affirmation that really lets us know who we are. And when you wrote in the book that Jake died and you were basically resurrected as Laura, the way that God created you to be, that was incredibly powerful and beautiful as well. So if you could just take a moment and speak to the parents out there. I can't imagine the devastation I would feel if one of my children said, I want to be the opposite sex. I mean, that, like you said, I remember finding out it's a boy or it's a girl, and the excitement there. You shared the struggles you had with your mom. You shared how she kind of went from a legalistic view of God to a relational view of God. And she really had to get to that point of realizing that she couldn't fix you, but she had to pray for you and she was praying for you with a group of women in a Bible study, and that was beautiful as well.
Mhm.
But if you could just take a moment as we close here and speak to a parent who maybe has a child who is saying, I want to be a boy or I want to be a girl. That has to be incredibly difficult. Can you
Yeah.
just give them some words of wisdom today?
Yeah. First, I'm so sorry for what you're going through. I know how incredibly painful this is from what my mom has told me. But I also there's a couple of articles on my website that may help even more. I talk a lot about surrender. And you can go to transgender to transform.com, and there's a tab for parents. But the bottom line, with every parent that I talk to and I pray about what the Lord really wants me to share, God always brings me back to the reality that He wants a relationship with the parent, and He wants a deeper, to take them deeper, no matter where you're at in your spiritual journey. Because we make it, sometimes we think like life will be fine if we just get the kid fixed. God wants to do a work in you throughout this process. There's a reason He brings trials into our life, and it's to refine us. So we can choose to just wallow in the pit and stay there and just hope it gets better one day, or we can really surrender them to the Lord and we can pursue Him. I remember my parents were always, I always felt that they were trying to pull me towards them. And it's like they were chasing after me, trying to pull me towards them. And it drove me insane. And it made me reject them even more. I hated it. And I wanted my freedom, because I was angry at them and I was hurt and I was bitter. And so I didn't want a relationship with them at that time. And that happens a lot with adult children, especially prodigals. But when they begin to turn around and just pursue Jesus, I remember just being so curious about what's happened to them. Why are they all about Jesus now? And I could see the changes in them over the years, and they were so transformed through those years that it's what helped open my eyes to the fact that the gospel was true, the fact that Christ was real. They were such a testimony to me. God tells us all the time in the Word that we overcome the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony of what God has done. And it's not just our word, but our living it in front of people. We can't give away what we don't have. So if you're pursuing your child and you're obsessing over them 24 hours a day, you are empty spiritually and you can't give away anything to them. But if you are completely full of Jesus, it will flow out of you. Jesus said, out of your belly will flow rivers of living water. So the key is not to pursue your child. The key is to pursue Jesus. He will pursue them and He will draw them to you. Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. So just like Peter, Jesus called him to walk out on the water. And as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he was walking on the water. But as soon as he was looking at the storm, he began to sink. So the key is to not look at the storm. The key is to keep our eyes on Jesus and to pursue Him. That's what Jesus wants from me most of all.
That's an absolute mic drop, Laura. Those words are so incredibly powerful. And that applies to every situation we're facing in our lives. The Bible says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. And I think we go into fix it mode and we're not able to fix it, but we put all of our energy into something we can't even do, and we make the situation worse. Laura, I just want to thank you for your courage to tell your story. And I just think you are a beautiful daughter of God. I know that God calls you His daughter. You're a beautiful daughter of God. You're beautiful inside and out. And I pray that God will open many doors for you to get this message out, to get the book out, because we need to come against the lies of the enemy that are just running rampant today and trying to steal the identity of His sons and daughters.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this message.
You're very welcome. And thank you for being our guest today. God bless you.
God bless.
Thank our audience for watching this episode of Voices of Recovery. We're creating a safe place where people can go on their journey with God. If you're new here, I'd love it if you give us a like or follow. And if you feel led, please share this message out, because I know there's somebody on your page who needs to hear what Laura had to say today. So I will post the link to the book and your website. You've got some incredible resources there for everyone. And God bless you, Laura, and thank you again. And thank you to our audience. We'll see you next time on Voices of Recovery. Bye-bye.
God bless you.